Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode and the final one that we're going to do, focusing on those macronutrients that we've been talking about so much for the last couple episodes. Today, Brandley and we are going to hit on as best and as concisely as we can without too many tangents, but I apologize ahead of time for my ADD brain
No
and
promises.
what it thinks about. But we are going to try to go over carbs, carbohydrates specifically, what they are, what they do for us, why they're important, as well as fats, or in the scientific world, what are called lipids. So anyone going through biology has heard of lipids, but that is what fats are. Whether they are saturated or unsaturated does make a difference. We're going to go into what kind of foods are higher in one or the other. And then again, why fats are important, and why there's a lot of misconceptions around both as far as to fitness and nutrition and performance. So yeah, without much or further ado, and also how kids, you need to be eating your veggies. Okay.
Yeah.
If it's green, my rule of thumb for every client I've ever had, if it's green, it's a go, and it's all good for you. So without much further ado, of course, Brandley, where do we want to kick this off at?
Yeah, let's go ahead and just start by breaking down carbs and fats. I think it's important to cover why we're like kind of lumping them together in this one episode. And really is the most like simple way to look at them is that they're both different types of fuel sources for our body. And that they're used in different ways depending on, like what kind of exercise you're doing, or, how much like carbs compared to fats you're eating throughout the day. So they're going to have a different effect. But the most basic way to look at them is just different fuel sources for our body. And they do other things as well. But energy and fuel is like the main focus with that. So we can start with carbs real quick, just because I feel like that one has the most like misinformation and kind of like misinterpretations out there around it. And it can be kind of controversial whenever you're looking at just like social media and whatnot. So carbs are essentially like our body's most efficient fuel source. Like whenever we're exercising or working out or playing sports or anything like that, carbs are the easiest for our body to use as an energy source. And there are certain exceptions to that, but as a main rule of thumb, our body wants to use carbs. That's really the most important thing there. And in terms of carbs, we do store them that we can use so we can use them for energy later, but at a very limited amount. So like, for example, you might hear people say like glycogen, which sounds like maybe a fancy word if you never heard of it before, but really what it is just our body's way of storing carbohydrates, which usually get stored in the muscle cells. And the reason they get stored there is because that's what our muscles use primarily for whenever we're, working out or training, or any form of exercise we're doing with that. So that's a really good basic way to look at carbs and how they affect our nutrition essentially. So
No, exactly, man. And with both of these, and even with I think we kind of touched on it in the protein episode, everybody, is food is fuel. And especially if you're looking into the performance realm, or you're just active in general, like not so much like you're playing sports, but if you're an active individual, we need to be looking at your food as fuel. And even if you're restarting that engine, I've dealt with a lot of clients that are going through, essentially a quote unquote like transformation. Like they're trying to really rework their life, restart the metabolic engine, and really lose weight. And one way to do that is really helping them understand the food is the fuel. It can still taste great, and we don't have to be overly restrictive on things, but we do need to understand what some of those food sources are, and which ones are the most nutrient dense, so that we can fuel our bodies and feel satiated or fuller for longer periods of time. So I'm really glad we led off with carbs, because some of the main fuel sources that we can find really good clean carbs for our body. And what I mean by that is food that we can eat that our body will process and utilize with very efficiently and very cleanly, and it won't store on us unless we are eating in excess. I tell my 5 and my 3-year-old, whether they understand it or not, is too much of a too much of a good thing is still bad, but going into those sources, if we were to look at this, like most fruits, and what I tell a lot of clients is anything that's a berry, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, like those like are amazing carb sources because they also have natural sugars. The same with apples, bananas, pears and apples are super high in fiber. So if you're having fiber issues or gut issues, those are great to have, or I should say digestion. The next one would be like rice. Rice is fantastic. White or brown, it really doesn't matter. Of course, brown rice is going to be more whole grain, so a little better, but it does take longer to cook. So if you're like balling on a budget and you're short on time, you might just want to look at some rice and some white rice. The next would be white potatoes, perfectly great, especially to have a day before like a big event or a couple hours before like a big lift. That's great to go. Sweet potatoes are my favorite. Same reasons, really good. Oatmeal is fantastic, especially for me in the morning. I love me a bowl of oatmeal. Tortillas are quick, man. Tortillas, especially whole wheat tortillas, that's a full send. The next couple things would be like beans and like squash. Those are some pretty common, like really quick things that you can look at as far as carbs that I use on a pretty weekly, monthly basis. And I mean, I feel pretty great.
Yeah, I think too, another thing to look at, I think a lot of people are scared of this one, but like even bread itself is pretty good. Is a great carb source.
Yeah.
It just, you got to be a little more sparing with it sometimes because, depending on what kind of bread you get, it can be a little bit higher in calories. So if you're trying to lose weight, maybe not always the best thing to reach for. But bread by itself isn't going to make you fat. It's just the fact that it has a little more higher calories. One thing, especially like if you're having a hard time getting enough carbs in, which is usually a rare thing, but if you are having a hard time getting enough carbs in, bagels are actually a really good one as well too. But same thing, can be a little bit higher in calories. So if you're not trying to gain some weight or something like that, maybe want to avoid the bagels.
Yeah, I mean, hey, whenever I've been in a bulk series, everybody, bagels are a pretty easy way to get a very dense, high calorie carb, especially in the morning. But yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, exactly. Bread in and of itself is not bad. Again, kind of like with tortillas, like I mentioned, like if you're going to look at a bread source, if you can, and I understand sometimes it's a texture taste thing for people, but leaning more towards the whole grain, whole wheat area, and it's the same thing with the rice. The brown rice is just going to be higher in fiber. It's going to be just a little better as far as nutrient density that our body will be able to utilize more efficiently. Most white breads, unless you make it yourself, there's just a little more additives in there. It's just kind of like empty calories for us that our body just, there's not much there for it to really fuel and burn.
Yeah. And a good way to find out if your bread is truly like a whole wheat or a whole grain or something like that, look on the ingredients label. So like if you flip it around the back and look at all the ingredients included, if it says enriched anywhere on there, it actually just means it's a fancy word for processed. So like, for example, you could go to Walmart and pick up like a loaf of whole wheat bread and you flip it around and it says enriched on there. Well, it's actually not really whole wheat. It's actually partially like white bread or partially really processed bread as well too. So even though it may say wheat on there, it's actually not truly a wheat bread as well too. Just a little side hack there for you.
Yeah, I was glad you brought that up because in the back of my head, I mean, it's just been a long day. I was like, wait, what's the thing on the label? It says what? So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I really hope that helps for a lot of people out there. Let's see. Oh, here's a good topic. And you and I both played sports. Carb loading. Let's talk about carb loading. What can we quickly say about carb loading?
Yeah. So carb loading is great, especially if you're more like an endurance type athlete. So if you're doing longer distance running or, you're doing track or cross country or anything like that. I mean, honestly, even if you're playing football or maybe baseball, I don't know. I wouldn't say baseball for much, but I didn't play baseball, so I don't really know. But I would say like more things like track, like cross country or swimming or anything like that. Carb loading is a great thing to do. Basically what carb loading is, when we talked about glycogen earlier and how like carbs get stored in your muscle cells, carb loading before competition is just a way to make sure that you are maxing out the stored carbohydrates that you have in your body. The good thing about that is that it's going to make sure you don't have any dips in performance when you're competing or anything like that. Now you don't need to go overboard with it. You don't need to like slam 500 grams of carbs the night before, your competition or anything like that. But you can have like a higher carb meal before the night before, or even the day before, just up your carbohydrates. That's just a good way to make sure you have enough energy for when you are competing. Even if you're competing like later in the day, breakfast, you can eat a higher amount of carbs as well too. I remember like when I used to do swim team, we used to have spaghetti for dinner the night before. And it was just like a fun thing to do. It was like spaghetti nights before swim meets, but also it was good for carb loading as well too.
Yeah. I was going to ask, I'm really glad you brought up that specific example, because I was going to ask you if you knew of, or if you experienced like a certain, time delay or a time frame from which you wanted to quote unquote carb load. Because like I understood carb loading in college when I played lacrosse. But at one point, the way it was implemented for me, like never helped me perform right. But again, that was a coach's call, instead of like carb loading the night before and then like kind of giving us tips of what to do. Cause it was typically like afternoon or mid-afternoon games. But somehow we always met for like this brunch hour, and we just like went to the local Italian spot and like housed spaghetti. And I always went into that game like 3 hours later, like just feeling like a bag of bricks was in my stomach.
Yep.
So, I mean, it got to a point where I would go as like a formality, but I'd ask for a salad. And because I would have woken up and I would have had like bacon, eggs, and a whole huge bowl of oatmeal or something in the morning, just because when going into those games like heavy, I was like, oof, this is rough.
Yeah, it's like you have to play around with it to see what you like as well. But I even fall into that trap, like just for working out. I used to live and die by like pre-workout carbs, but I would use it as like an excuse to eat a bunch of food before I went to the gym.
Yeah.
So like I used to slam like a bagel and like 2 Pop-Tarts, or like I would eat just like Rice Krispie treats just for fun, and I would like tell myself like, oh, this is gonna help me out during my workout, and then I get there and I just feel so like sluggish and terrible, and it would really, really affect my workout. So it going overboard with the carbs, it can be a bad thing as well.
I myself, I'm not a big proponent personally of like the carb loading before a workout, but if I know I'm going to have like a workout that's going to have like some pretty big lifts where I'm going to need a big energy demand, my rule of thumb, and this is kind of like I just have to listen to my body that day, but it's typically like 2 hours or so, or 2.5 hours, like before I know that that's going to happen, I will have a meal that maybe has a little more rice in it, or I'll eat some potatoes or something, or just have a little more like something. But yeah, I've never been one that's like going into the lift like house and rice cakes. Let's freaking go, rice cakes and peanut butter sandwiches.
That's actually, I think I like working out, even competing. Like when I was playing football, I think I like to compete and work out actually on an empty stomach. Same thing goes for jujitsu right now, because that's something I'm getting really heavy into. But I like to be on an empty stomach. I don't know why, but I just think it does it. I feel less slow. But I honestly, unless you're an athlete or unless you're just doing like crazy amounts of like cardio or just high intensity workouts, I don't think the average person trains hard enough to really worry about carb loading. But I think so many people focus on it. In all reality, probably what's more important, instead of eating so many carbs beforehand, is just making sure you're prioritizing carbs after. I think that's the bigger thing to focus on, not trying to maximize your glycogen stores before you go into the gym or something like that.
And this, oh man, this is such a good topic. My brain just went to this. I think we've brought this up is looking at your day and when do you typically work out? Like when does it functionally work for your schedule? Are you an early AM-er? Are you a mid-morning? Are you an afternoon? Are you an evening? If you know your routine and when you're going to have that energy output and expenditure, well, then we need to look at functionally what's going to work for your day to, one, fuel you for your day, but also keeping in mind, like if you have an evening workout after an entire day of whatever it is you do as an occupation, well, if you like to go into that dry, great. if you're dragging your butt through the gym door, like dredging the lift because you're gassed, well, then we need to look at having some type of a meal 3-4 hours before so that you can be ready and have something for that. And that's just proper planning prevents piss poor performance. Like that's just the 6 common P's, so yeah, there's that. And so I'm the same way. If I don't work out first thing in the morning, I'm typically like a mid-morning, preferably kind of workout person. On a busy day, like Wednesdays are my busiest day. That's when we're filming it, is on a Wednesday. My gap of time is like right before my afternoon classes start. So it's later afternoon. And if I do not have some type of a meal or heavy snack beforehand, I will be dragging. Like I will be double scooping that pre-workout just to get through.
Yeah.
That's man, those were golden topics. Those are golden things to hit on.
Yeah, I think if you're gonna do pre-workout carbs to help with energy, look at like 3 to 4 hours beforehand. I think that's a really good time frame. Not 30 to 40 minutes beforehand. You can actually have like digestive issues too, and deal with like a lot of cramping and whatnot if you time it out poorly. But I think that's a good final note to kind of hit on carbohydrates, is they actually play a huge role in recovery as well too. I know when we went over protein, we said that protein is the main thing that recovers or like helps like rebuild muscle tissue. While that is true, you actually do need carbs as well. One, because carbs are going to help replenish all the energy you just expended when you worked out, but also they have like a protein sparing effect. So basically what that means is if you incorporate carbohydrates with protein after exercise, it does allow your body to use that protein more efficiently for what it's supposed to do. So they do help out with recovery, and they also help out with energy as well too. So if you're like constantly training super hard, you're feeling really run down and you're feeling sluggish, and maybe you're noticing you're starting to get a little more sore and you're getting, way more tired than you're supposed to be, start adding a little more carbs in. I think that's a great way to look at that.
Right. Someone asked, just because there are many supplement companies out there that do put out like a glucose recovery or some type of a post-workout carb powder. And what I was on a really good conversation last night with one of my online clients for his nutrition battle plan, is what I call it, is, the way I think about it, and it's not a bad thing, but I would rather eat my calories and fuel than drink them. And not saying I have anything against those products. It's just for the body to grab out more than just the carb. Like there's more in rice, or there's just, especially vegetables. Like if we look at vegetables, like vegetables are way more than just like the menial carbs that are in there. Like there are other micronutrients, there's other fiber in there, like fruit. I love telling people, like, look, you can eat fruit. If it's a berry, eat it. If it's an apple or a pear, go for it. I mean, you've got fiber, you've got all these other micronutrients in there, and antibiotics or things in there that like your body needs. And you're not going to get that from a carb replacement powder. Now, again, while it has its place, you got to remember, supplementation is just that. It's to supplement what you cannot adequately get like in your day-to-day. But I would rather you eat the clean food and eat the fuel and enjoy it and have a good, healthy relationship with the food.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to bring up with the carb powders. She's like, I used to work at a supplement store, and I used to live and die by the carb powders after a workout. Like that, I was like, that was the hill I was going to die on, is that you needed post-workout carbs and you needed that glucose powder. Since then, I've really kind of changed my perspective on it. And it's kind of like what I mentioned earlier. Most people don't train hard enough to actually qualify to be able to drink something like that. That's just the hard truth behind that. I don't train hard enough to drink carb powders after I work out, and I'll be honest with that. Another thing is people don't have a hard time eating enough food. People have a hard time eating too much food. So if you're drinking your carbs and you're drinking your calories that way, it's actually less filling than you would with eating them. So I like what you said about saving your calories for the carbs, or saving your carbs to eat something that actually has calories, because you're actually going to feel fuller that way, and it'll actually help you prevent from overeating as well too. So unless you're out there crushing like 100-mile races every weekend or something like that, like you don't need to be, with messing around with carb powders, that's just kind of my 2 cents on it.
Before we quickly move on to fats, guys, look at any endurance athlete, especially triathlon Ironman. If you saw the amount of carbs that they eat every day, it would blow your mind, even Olympic level athletes. And again, that's because they need it. Like their bodies need that fuel. So using that as a segue, another source of fuel we have in our body are fats. What do we got with that? What do we got with that, Brainley? What do we got?
Yeah. So if carbs are our fast, efficient fuel, I like to think of fats as like our slower burning fuel, but they're more of like an insurance policy for our bodies. And the reason I say that is our body stores more fat than it burns typically. I mean, maybe there are some cases where you burn more fat than you actually store. But typically, like, it's a lot easier for our bodies to store fat as body fat. And the reason it does that, I mean, if you want to look from like a evolutionary standpoint, it was like an insurance method. Like if we didn't know when we were going to get calories next, we want to store this fat away so we can use it for calories later. So typically it's a lot harder for our body to use, not harder to use, but our bodies are way better at using carbs for energy than it is using fats, which is why fat tends to get stored away more. Fats also pack a heavier punch when it comes to calories. So if we're talking about calories, carbs usually have about 4 calories per gram. Fat, on the other hand, has 9 calories per gram. So even though you're eating the same volume of food with carbs and fats, you're actually getting way more calories than with fat as well too. So that's going to be a big thing to note with that is they have way more calories. They're usually a less efficient fuel source, and our body really only uses fat if we don't have enough carbs available. That's really the main standpoint with that. Now you can make yourself better at using fat for fuel. Just simply by eating a lower carb diet, your body will start to get a lot better at using fat for fuel. But I mean, you really only want to do that if you're an endurance athlete, because, and we can kind of dive into why that is. But typically endurance athletes, like long endurance athletes, triathlon athletes and whatnot, they're going to be the ones that need to use that fat as well for a fuel source. But that's kind of like the main breakdown with fat. It's just a less efficient fuel source, usually has a lot more calories, typically serves a different purpose than carbs do. We can hit on that a little bit later, but fats, they really do help out with like hormone production. That's a huge thing with them as well too. So
yeah. So to tap on that real quick before we dive into maybe some of the sources and how healthy fats are utilized is for men and women, we have to realize that we do have hormones. You know, we have estrogen, we have testosterone, and we have so many other things in between per whatever our sex is, our gender, whatever, you know, yeah, sex, whatever. I'm not going to get into that wild mess. But regardless, we have to realize that our bodies do have a lot of hormone levels that we need to be very cautious of. So with men, we have a little more leeway. We can still pick having our fuel source be carbs or fats, or maybe a slight mix of both. We just have to be careful about it, you know, just smart, I should say. But we have a little more leeway. Women, however, it has to be one or the other, but they have to realize that per hormone levels, they like, and this is kind of across the board for women, is with fat intake, it really should not be at all any lower than 50 grams a day. Like you start dropping below that, and like for men, if one hormone gets messed up, we feel like junk, it's this, that, or another, and like we'll kind of push through it because we're morons. But like for women, if one hormone or one thing with the fats drops, there is a domino effect. And again, I'm not a hormone specialist. That's a disclaimer right here. I just know enough working with enough women. Like one hormone gets off, and it is a domino effect within the rest of the body as far as what occurs. And so it can send a woman's body into a very dark spiral, for which we got to like climb ourselves out in a healthy way to make sure that we reach that homeostasis again, or that equilibrium.
yeah.
So, oh, sorry, did you have something?
Oh yeah. No, I guess if you really want to dive into that, a good thing to look up to if you are a female listener right now. A good thing to look up is the female athlete triad, I think is what it's called. But that kind of dives into what happens when females don't have enough fat in their diet and don't have enough body fat. I don't know anything about hormones. I mean, maybe I know a little bit, but I'm not an expert either. I know that if women or females have way too little body fat, or they're not eating enough fat throughout the day, it can have some serious issues with their hormones, but also with their reproductive process as well too. Specifically, females, they could lose their period for months at a time from having not enough fat, which, I mean, maybe that's not something that we need to worry about now, but disclaimer, fat's a good thing. It's supposed to be in your diet. Yeah. Just a quick tangent on that.
Yeah, like the big thing we said off the bat and with this episode, like, look, fats and carbs are not inherently bad. Overindulging in one or the other often is what will make you fat. I mean, it just has to be said. Or overindulging in both will make you fat. It will make you obese, it will make you overweight, and it'll put you in some severe chronic health risks, for which the fallout from those is potentially death or some very, very, very rough lifestyle byproduct of that. So to look into just very quickly some clean fat sources that have what we're going to call what is unsaturated fats, which unsaturated fats, like foods, if you look on labels that are higher in unsaturated fat, it's way easier for our bodies to process and eliminate rather than store for a longer period of time. It gets utilized a little quicker and it burns through. So things like this would be like olive oil, coconut oil, most nut butters, like almond, cashew, peanut butter, raw mixed nuts. Like, you can have a little flavor on there, but like in a previous episode, Brainly thinking, oh, these nuts have protein in them and fats, like this is good for me. And they were the honey roasted peanuts or something.
Yeah.
So something like that, that's kind of like baked and all of that, and just has sugar hanging off of it. That is not what we're talking about. While they are super tasty, and trust me, I've had my fair share. So moving on. So mixed nuts, I tell people either raw or try to go lightly salted. Some people do have issues with almonds, and so I say, hey, look at the ones that are dark chocolate covered in like a dark chocolate powder. It's pretty good for you. Avocados are great. Butter, specific, like literally stick butter, not margarine, not what comes in a tube or in a tub, and not Crisco. Absolutely not. Butter, stick butter. Cheeses, most cheeses are good. I am slightly lactose intolerant, so if I do want cheese, I have to look at something that's like low skim or low fat. Like, I have to look at something very specific just so that my gut does not get torn up. Pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, those like right off the hip, all of that. So again, going through olive oil, coconut oil, nut butters, raw, mixed or nuts, avocados, stick butter, cheeses, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds. Boom.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit as well too. Eggs, great source of fat.
Oh yeah, egg. Yeah, I got you.
Egg yolk. I mean, they're mostly protein, but they do have a good source of fat in them as well too. Yeah. Another thing, animal fat that you get off of meat is totally fine as well. It's the type of meat that matters though. So like, for example, a steak, the fat that you're gonna get on there, totally fine. Salami or hot dogs, the fat you're gonna get out of there, not good. The way I like to look at that is like, if it naturally occurs in the world, it's a good way to get it. You're not going to walk out and find a salami tree, or you're not going to find salami or hot dogs out in nature, you know what I'm saying? So those go through like a processing kind of like, they're heavily processed, so they're a different type of fat. Another thing with the oils as well too, it may sound really healthy, but vegetable oil, you want to stay away from that. That's a whole rabbit hole that I don't want to dive into with this.
Not yet.
But just have a little common sense. Like, how the heck are you going to get oil out of a vegetable? That's all I'm going to say. heavily processed. Our bodies they have a whole different process with that they go through. It reacts completely differently, and it can have some negative side effects as well too. So try to stay away from that. If you're going to do oil, olive oil, coconut oil, or avocado oil is a good one. Now, Marcel did mention to you unsaturated fats and saturated fats. Those, to not get too into the weeds on that, it basically, they're separated because of the way they're chemically structured. So that's just like a really easy way to say it. But if you want to know a good way to determine what a saturated fat and what's an unsaturated fat, just imagine like what state are they in at room temperature. So if you were to just leave it in the middle of a room, would it be liquid or would it be solid? If it's going to be liquid, it's unsaturated fat. If it's solid, it's saturated fat. So things like butter or cheese or fat that you get off meat, those are your saturated fats. Things like olive oil, nut butters, egg yolks a little bit as well too. Those are going to be mostly unsaturated fats because they come in that liquid form. So that's a really good way to kind of split that up.
Yeah, that is really good, and I'm glad you brought up the byproduct from the meat, as well as I had another really good conversation today with a client, and she had so many concerns over like meat and fats, and I'm like, hey, like if it's a natural occurring meat, like the fat that's coming off of that is fine. It's not anything to stress about. In fact, your body, like we said, just a little bit ago, your body's just going to process it a lot faster. It's not going to store it it's not going to like store it in a way that's going to hold itself on you. It will be utilized because of the type of which it is. And again, fats are not the devil guy, but we have to realize that grease vat that carton of fries is coming out of is not what your body needs. And I know that may sound like common sense to a lot of people, but like most fast food places, like even if you order a burger, you should really research and look at that burger. Like the burger's got way more fats in it than it has any amount of protein. Like even that junior bacon, or what's it called? The Baconator, even though there's a ton of patties on that Baconator from Wendy's, like it's way, way, way high in fat, and it's going to like fulfill like probably more than half of your daily allotment in just one sandwich. And that's the other with the fuel, we have to think about fueling our bodies efficiently over an entire day, not just in like one big drop. Like that's not what we want to do, because that goes into a whole world of insulin spiking and dropping, and how the body kind of like the sugars and this, that, or another. And again, that's a whole nother weedy subject to get into. But again, guys, we got to think, what is it we're eating, and what is it ultimately doing for us and our goals? And I hope by the time that all of these episodes drop, that you guys are able to reach out to us and ask us more questions, because knowing what specifically you all are going through and experiencing, and knowing your specific questions, helps us. One, we can tailor future content around it, and two, we can specifically reach back out to you and help you through this journey.
Yeah. Man, that was good. I had a train of thought that I totally lost on that. Yeah, no, I think a good way, just to kind of end it on a high note here, if you're listening to this and you're kind of confused about where you want to get your foods from, fats and carbs that you get from natural sources or whole foods, that's the best place to get them. The best way to tell if something is a whole food is if it's a single ingredient item. If it's one ingredient that makes up that food, it's a whole food. If you're getting it from processed food, so if it's coming out of a bag, a box, a bottle, or a can, it's most likely going to be processed. You just want to stay away from that, typically, because whenever there's fat or carbs added in there, they're not added in there for nutritional value. They're added in there for taste, so they don't take into account calories. And that's why people have a hard time with overeating, because they eat these carbs and these fats for taste and not for fuel. Now, you could totally have those things. You need to be really, really, really moderate whenever you try to include those into your diet. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a perfect high note to end on, guys. And again, we're prepping a lot of this content so that once it does drop and you guys are listening to this, like this stuff has already been pre-recorded. Please, at this point, if you have not already, follow us on Facebook or Instagram. Follow Brainley's page on Facebook, Eat Like a Man. Guys, I can't say enough. Like, I love reading the articles that he puts out because they're so to the point, and they're just written in a way that any Joe Blow or Jane Doe on the block can kind of pick it up and read it, and it makes sense. And he like I said, he's worked at a supplement store. He himself has been, in the fitness world for a hot minute too. So like, we are both here as sources to utilize. So I'm typically on Instagram at phoenix.fit, phnx.fit. I have a Facebook page. I operate more through Instagram and stuff, but you guys can always reach out. We're both here to help, and we want to see youth, parents, adults, everybody, like we can all be and do better. And it just takes effort, and it just takes consistency, and your goals can be achieved. But anything else, Bob?
No, I think you got it there. I think that was awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a good night, a good day, and just keep killing it out there. Be savages. Take care.